Hey guys. All right, we're going to do a little macro 2015 FRQ number one. Number one here. Assume the United States economy is operating below full employment. I understand that that's kind of code. If we're below full employment, we have to be in a recession. So we're just going to draw a simple aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph of us. Price level on the vertical, real GDP on the horizontal, upward sloping short run aggregate supply, downward sloping aggregate demand. Now, to show that recession, we could just do this. This is where we are right now. Let's see if they make us label it. Y1, PL1. Make sure you have everything added in here. Long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Our current equilibrium output and price, this is P1. Y1, we could have labeled this YF. That would have been full employment right there. Yep, full employment labeled YF. Got it. Now, assume that the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate to reach full employment. Should the Federal Reserve target a higher or lower federal funds rate? First, we need to just know what a federal funds rate is. The federal funds rate is simply the rate of interest that banks charge one another. It is bank-to-bank loans, that rate of interest that banks charge one another. So, to get us out of a recession, we know that the Fed is going to use expansionary monetary policy. And we always write this the same way. We're going to say that the money supply would increase. This is going to drive down nominal interest rates. When interest rates go down, do people invest more at lower interest rates or less? Obviously, they're going to invest more. So investment goes up. Investment drives up aggregate demand. Aggregate demand going up drives up the price level. Real GDP increases. Output increases. Unemployment will go down. This is just our causal chain of thinking. I tend to write it out every time. Obviously not on a test, I wouldn't write it out, but it helps. If you know this chain of cause and effect, then clearly you can answer a lot of multiple choice questions very quickly by knowing what's going on here. So let's go back to B. Assume that the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate. Should the Federal Reserve target a higher or lower federal funds rate? Well, to get us back to full employment, the Fed needs to increase the money supply, which is going to drive down interest rates. So that would be a lower federal funds rate, right? They're going to drive down interest rates, and the federal funds rate obviously is an interest rate that would go down also. So we want a lower federal funds rate. This makes sense. If banks have more money, they can lower their interest rates, and obviously this will increase aggregate demand back to full employment. That's the action there. C, given the Federal Reserve's action you identified in Part B, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effects on the nominal interest rates. So we're just going to draw. You obviously need to know that money supply is vertical here. The Fed controls all the money supply, so it always is controlled at the quantity right there, straight up and down. Demand for money is downward sloping. Nominal interest rates on the vertical, quantity of money on the horizontal. Now, we know that the Fed increased the money supply, right? We know when money supply shifts to the right, it's obviously going to drive down the interest rate. So that interest rate is going to fall as there's more money in the system. And that would make sense. If banks have more money, they need to get rid of it. They make their money by loaning it out. So they're going to lower their rate of interest so that more people come in and take out loans, which makes more investment, which shifts up aggregate demand, price level, real GDP output, and unemployment would go down. All right, D. We switched from monetary to fiscal. So the policymakers instead want a fiscal policy rather than monetary. Assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and the value of the gap is 300 billion. So up here, our gap is the difference from Y1 to YF, or the distance here, would be 300 billion. So understand that they always do these kind of things the same way, right? They're going to give you the MPC, which is 0.8. You're going to find the MPS, which is 0.2. Understand that your MPC plus your MPS are going to always equal 1. So if this is 0.8, this has to be 0.2 to equal 1. We're trying to find our multiplier here, and it is our government spending multiplier. So it is going to be 1 over the MPS. And I'm like a child. I have to do this the same way every time. 1 over 0.2 is going to equal 5. This thing, 20 cents, goes into a dollar how many times? 5 times, right? All right. If the government changes its spending without changing taxes to eliminate the recessionary gap, calculate the minimum required changes in government spending. So here's our multiplier. What we're going to say is when government spending, I'm assuming, goes up, times our multiplier is going to give us, we need 300 billion of GDP, obviously increase, right? So we need to shift aggregate demand back to the right. That means the government spending has to be expansionary. And we could just take the 300 billion divided by 5 here, which I believe is 60. Yeah, 60 billion. So the government spending needs to be 60 billion times the 5 will give us 300 billion of GDP. And that's the understanding of the multiplier. It's the idea that the government doesn't have to spend the whole 300 billion. That as the government spends, all of that money flows out into the economy. It becomes somebody else's income. And they spend, and they spend, and they spend, etc., etc. Multiplied by 5, we found the multiplier. We're going to get 300 billion of real GDP increase. Number 2 is if the government changes taxes without changing any government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater, smaller than, or equal to the change in government spending? A quick note here is that your taxing multiplier is always 1 less than your spending multiplier. So if my taxing multiplier, my government spending multiplier is 5, my taxing multiplier is going to be 4. That's the quick and easy way just to know. Can we look at it? Can we know the formula? Can you do it? Absolutely. Just save yourself some time. Know that it's always going to be 1 less than your government spending multiplier. So the idea is what do taxes have? We know it's expansionary, right? We want aggregate demand to increase, so we know taxes have to go down. Make sure you tell them that, right? The taxes go down. Whatever taxes go down, that'll be multiplied by 4, and we need that 300 billion GDP increase. So taxes need to, obviously, to get GDP to increase, we need taxes to go down, 75. We could have done 300 billion divided by 4. And that would have given us 75. And that makes sense. The taxes need to go down by more than government spending. Remember, government spending only went down, or government spending increased by 60, but taxes have to go down by 75. They want us to explain this, and there's a couple things we always talk about when we explain the taxing multiplier. One is it's 1 less than the government spending multiplier. And I'm kind of writing it in shorthand, but you'd have to write it out a little bit more. You would just say that the taxing multiplier is always 1 less than the government spending multiplier. Therefore, you would have to lower taxes by a larger amount. The second reason, I think, is the one that's a little bit truer to the point here, is that, think about this, if the government cuts your taxes by $1,000, do you rush out and spend that whole $1,000? Or might you save some of it? Think about that. Now, if the government spends $1,000, immediately that $1,000 flows out into the economy, becomes somebody else's income, etc., etc. But if the government cuts your taxes by $1,000, I'm thinking that most people wouldn't just run out and spend $1,000. I wouldn't anyway. I'd probably save most of it. So that's our second reason of why we would say that the taxing multiplier has to be larger than the government spending, or the amount of taxes has to be larger than the amount of government spending, is because some of the tax cut is saved? This is a stock question. We have to know this question because they're going to ask it. And it's easier if we already have it in our head and we can just, bang it out on the table exactly what we're expecting here. One less than the government spending multiplier. They've accepted that in the past at places, but this is probably your best answer. Some of the tax cut is saved. All right, and here's E. Again, this is sort of assume the government lowers the income tax rate to eliminate the recessionary gap. Will each of the following increase, decrease, or stay the same? Well, you and I know when taxes go down, right? Think about this. If taxes go down, do people have more disposable income? I would say they do. When they have more disposable income, does consumption go up? They're going to spend it? Absolutely. When consumption goes up, we know it's a determinant of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand goes up, the price level goes up. Real GDP is going to go up, output's going to go up. And unemployment is going to go down. This is our causal chain of thinking with taxes decreasing or fiscal policy change there. And we would explain it like this. Obviously, you want to explain it better than this. They're clearly talking about aggregate demand. So we definitely want to talk about what caused the taxes when they went down. We want to make sure we say, yeah, I think you could probably get away without the disposable income, but I like it. I always add it in there. Taxes is going to affect consumption. Lower taxes means people have more money. You've got to have consumption increases. Therefore, that's going to make aggregate demand increase. These are necessary causal chain of effects that we have to talk about. Long run aggregate supply curve. Again, this is, do we know what's going on here? With interest rates. And I think we could. This is a fairly bit more complicated, right? If taxes are going down, we know, taxes are going down. We know that's expansionary. Kind of the same thing as if government spending is going up. We know that's expansionary. We're just going to understand that if it relates to government spending going up, real interest rates are going to go up also. And if real interest rates go up, we know there's going to be less investment. That means less capital formation. And less capital formation means our long run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. They could have also used, instead of long run aggregate supply, they could have asked about long run growth or economic growth. We would have said that decreased. They could have asked about your PPC. We would have said that shifted in. Right? It was a shift in, your PPC shifted in. Or they could have, every so often, they'll talk about potential GDP. And that decreased. All of these are linked together, and they all have to do with that long run growth. And they all trace back to what's going on with the real interest rate. So if you can figure out the real interest rate, you definitely know what's going on with long run aggregate supply or growth or the PPC or potential GDP. Okay. Thanks, guys. Be safe.